Hi, I'm Ruth Murgatroyd, and I'm a volunteer with the York Sunbury Historical Society Program Committee. And I would like to welcome everyone to our second virtual presentation of our program season. Let's begin by asking Charles to introduce our speaker. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruth. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my friend and classmate, Ian Baird. Ian is uniquely situated in his work as both a financial services professional and as a scholar in UNB's history department. Moreover, a community heritage activist, as both a member of the board of the New Brunswick Museum and as treasurer of Fredericton's Heritage Trust. And within the UNB history community, he has the status of being an O'Brien Fellow. So very commendable background. Currently, Ian's focus is on how Canadians survived the First World War through their religious and spiritual experience in a context of death, anxiety, and bereavement. And this PhD dissertation subject has flowed quite seamlessly from the master's degree that forms the basis for tonight's talk. That MA, which was completed in 2018, interrogated the nexus between New Brunswick Anglican Great War sermons and voluntary enlistment among New Brunswick Anglican men. And indeed, Ian found quite a strong connection. And in the course of his research in his MA program, he made a very fascinating discovery. And that discovery forms the basis of tonight's talk, which is the interrogation of Bishop John Richardson's Holy War Crusade. Ian, we very much look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you. The name of the talk I'm delivering tonight is "It's a Holy War We Are Waging," which is a quote from Richardson, the unique case of Bishop John Richardson in the Anglican Church's Great War Crusade. I'm going to begin with a 1916 speech by Richardson to set the tone, followed by a short biography that situates him, as I said, in context. This requires that we know something of New Brunswick Anglicanism as Richard found it when he came here around the turn of the century, but also about 19th century Protestant theological responses to new scientific theories like evolution, biblical textual criticism, and social changes wrought by industrialization and urbanization. I'll then move to the war and Richardson's theological interpretations of it as he publicly expressed them. And finally, I will conclude with my insights on his behavior and what we might be able to learn from that and apply to contemporary events. So on February 1st, 1916, just 3 weeks before the German army launched its spring offensive at Verdun, and about 5 months before the opening of the Somme offensive battles, the spiritual head of New Brunswick's Anglicans delivered one of his most important speeches of the Great War. The occasion was the diocese annual general meeting of its governing body, called the Synod, comprising over 100 clergy and laity assembled at Fredericton City Hall. When John Richardson, the bishop of the Diocese of Fredericton, rose, he faced what must have been a very war-weary and anxious audience, no doubt in need of much inspiration and hope. The first third of that speech by Richardson was devoted to the war. It's available in the Synod Journal for this proceeding, and it was also printed widely in the press. He reminded his listeners that the church's first responsibility was to assist in the mobilization of the nation's resources, especially its manpower for military service. Important as this was, though, the church's greater mission was mobilizing Canada for a spiritual crusade. It was on this theme that the rest of the bishop's address hung, and he introduced it in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. I'll quote, "It is a holy war which we are waging. It is a war to which God is calling us. We have a right to be sure that God is on our side. If ever a nation was called to take up the sword, this nation has been so called." Now, these words must have jarred a bit in his audience's ears. Now, of course, many were already acquainted through the press with other Anglican clerics who by 1916 were already depicting the fight against Germany as a holy war. But those clerics were not in Canada, they were in England. In Canada up to this point, no prominent Anglican cleric had followed this example. However, those who recalled Richardson's synod address from the previous year, 1915, might have anticipated this development in their own bishop, because a year earlier, he had first revealed an ideological mindset that was perhaps predisposed to interpreting the world in cosmic terms. When the 1915 synod met, so remember, we're going back a year here now, the war was barely 6 months old. Canada's soldiers had yet to join the front lines. They were on their way, but they weren't there yet. Even so, imaginations by then were already beggared by news reports of casualties and material destruction. Some people of Old Testament persuasion saw the war as divine punishment for the West's descent into materialism and selfishness. Richardson did not. And I'll quote him again. He said, "I will not place upon the Almighty the responsibility for the devil's deeds. This is not God's war. This is not God's war. It is a war whose seeds were sown in hell. It is the devil's war." Now, Richardson did not believe the Germans were literal devils, but he was convinced that they had been seduced by dark forces into being unwitting agents of evil on earth. But what does the documentary record have to say about Richardson? What does it reveal or suggest about the mind of a man who just 2 years ago in peacetime was known for his moderation, yet who now appeared as a radical? Who was this man? Well, here's what we know. Melinda, if you could go to the next slide, please. Here we go. So John Andrew Richardson was born into the family of a high church clergyman in Warwick, England on October 30th, 1868. Following his early education, he emigrated in 1888 to Western Canada. After stints in farming and teaching, he enrolled at St. John's College, Winnipeg, where he earned his BA and MA degrees. In 1899, 3 years after his ordination, Richardson took up missionary work in the Maritimes, in St. John, to be precise, where his gift for oratory and a talent for connecting with children resulted in his being offered the rectorship of the famous Trinity Church in St. John by the then Bishop Kingdon. This appointment and his acceptance of it marked the beginning of a truly impressive 39 career in the diocese. It was meteoric. I struggle with that word. It was meteoric, in fact. So he was made a canon of Christ Church Cathedral in 1902. He was elected to bishop coadjutor in 1906. And then he was enthroned as the diocesan bishop in 1908, a few months after Kingdon's death. Richardson's success was all the more notable for another reason. he was a theological liberal in a diocese where the Tractarian traditionalism of John Medley, the diocese's first bishop, was still quite popular with parishioners and, in fact, many of the clergy as well. It's hard to say if it was most of them. Some fulsome research might be able to turn that up, but significantly, the diocese was a small c conservative. Richardson possessed all the qualities of a natural leader. He was tall and athletic. He had an easy way. He had a good sense of humor, and he was possessed of oratory gifts, enriched by a famously fine voice, and he was a natural organizer. These qualities made him very popular, and he used this advantageously to bring a moderate evangelical zeal to a conservative church in a conservative province. His years in Winnipeg, which at the time was the center of the Canadian social gospel movement, were obviously formative for Richardson, as it manifested in the causes he embraced here in New Brunswick. He could always be counted among the most vocal advocates of social and moral reform, from improving prison conditions and labor laws to prohibitions on gambling and alcohol. So yes, he was a prohibitionist. We won't judge him for that. Yet, according to his biographers, one of whom, as I mentioned, is here this evening, he was no radical or partisan. His broad-mindedness struck the right note in a diocese that valued its conservative inheritance. And despite his liberalism, or maybe because of it, he remained convinced of the soundness of high church orthodoxy. And in the tradition of Anglican compromise, he sought to accommodate it with the liberal evangelicalism dominant not only in the Anglican clergy and seminaries at the time, but throughout Canadian Protestantism. The next step towards understanding Richardson and the radicalization of clerics like him in England during the war, and for that matter, other Protestant clerics in Canada, is to briefly summarize how liberal theology developed in the 150 odd years up to the war, and how this came to inform elite and popular views on the role of the British Empire and Canada's place within it. This is not going to be a deep dive. Don't worry. Much of what I'm doing next here in the next few minutes is just a high-level survey, but I think it's very important context. Liberal evangelicalism in the British tradition originated in the 18th century. Anglican revivalists like John Wesley taught that for a Christian to be made perfect in love, which means to be right with God, personal salvation alone is insufficient. The second commandment, to love one's neighbor as oneself, has to be actively lived. Now, this obligation to extend the personal into society at large separated liberal evangelicals, not wholly, but I mean, these categories aren't perfect, but they're useful, separated liberal evangelicals from their conservative counterparts, for the most part, who still upheld the primacy of personal salvation through private devotion, dogmas, and rites. By the turn of the 19th century, liberal evangelicals in the Anglican Church and its Wesleyan offshoot, alongside Quakers and other social and moral reformers, had gained considerable cultural influence. This liberalizing trend had its parallels in other Protestant denominations, especially Methodism, which at the time, or at least by the 1911 census, had replaced Presbyterians as Canada's largest Protestant denomination. The single largest denomination at the time was of course, Roman Catholicism. By the mid-19th century, revolutionary theological and scientific scholarship marked the beginning of the age of religious doubt in the West. Scriptural high criticism in the German universities and Darwin's evolutionary theories forced upon Christians specific existential questions. Central to these was asking what revelation God was trying to communicate through these challenges to scriptural authority. By the 1890s, Protestant theologians believed they had reconciled naturalistic evolution and an historicized Bible with religious mystery. Generally, all but the most fundamentalist creeds adopted an exegesis of progressive revelation. Viewing the arc of history and human progress through this lens, the British Empire came to be reimagined as a providential agent whose divine mission was to safeguard world peace and propagate Christian civilization for the spiritual and material uplift of humanity. So this externalization of the salvific impulse, which again was a liberal impulse, was harnessed to the church's missionary structures and made intrinsic not only to Canada's nation-building project, but also to that of the whole empire. In the process, a new and modern Christian identity synonymous with Canadianness and Britishness was constructed and widely embraced in English-speaking Canada, especially English-speaking Canadians of British Isles descent. Anglo-Saxon ethnicity combined with the sacred and secular to forge a new collective identity and mission. The intrinsic appeal of this identity is central to understanding what animated the dominant strains of Canadian Protestantism between 1914 and 1919. And this helps us understand their responses to Germany and the war for which it was blamed. In this light, it is easier to see how the war could be framed as an existential one between the agents of God, that being the empire and its allies, and the agents of evil, manifesting as the central powers led by a proto-fascist polity, as we might characterize it today, whose Lutheran state church preached a militarist doctrine of might makes right. In other words, something that resembled a holy war. Excuse me. When war came to the British Empire on August 4th, 1914, few observers foresaw its length and devastation. By 1915, though, a growing awareness in Canada of the war's true nature, its capacity for human and material destruction, and its psychological and emotional demands changed how people conceptualized and justified the conflict and its sacrifices. This was especially true for volunteer citizen soldiers and their families. The plaque on our cenotaph here in Fredericton, which was dedicated 99 years ago, this past Remembrance Day, last Friday, lists 106 of the 66,000 Canadian service personnel who were lost to their family and friends. Most were volunteers whose reasons for enlisting were based in notions of duty and honor, desire for adventure, escape from routine, boredom, unemployment, or combinations of these and other reasons. Societal pressure from private and institutional sources was another factor, however. And of all the nation's cultural institutions, quite probably or possibly the churches were the most influential in the gentle and occasionally not so gentle art of persuasion via the pulpit and the recruiting sermon. For those inclined to enlist, but maybe hesitated on moral and ethical grounds, it fell to the churches to articulate the justifications for going to war and taking human life. These justifications were found in the theological frameworks of righteousness and Augustinian just war theory. Christianity teaches that righteousness presupposes the justness of a cause, where one's motives must morally accord with God for actions and outcomes to be just. Just war theory provides strict theological conditions under which a war is righteous and therefore acceptable to God. Righteousness and just, those two words, are often used synonymously, or were often used synonymously by clerics in wartime sermons, despite their subtle theological distinctions, perhaps to simplify matters for their audiences. In any event, the righteousness of Canada's fight against Germany was the justification consistently used by Anglican clerics throughout the war, even as other themes came and went. Now, holy war is another matter. Holy war is a religious war, meaning that it has divine sanction and is fought in the name of God in a zero-sum contest against agents of evil. Distinctions of sacred and secular in a holy war blur or disappear as the whole resources of church, nation, and empire mobilize for the Great Crusade, as it were. The language of holy war was deployed at different times in all the belligerent nations, irrespective of faith, leading at least one scholar to characterize the conflict as the West's last religious war. The first intimations of holy war from Anglican pulpits appeared in mid to late 1915 in England. By then, even the most committed atheist could not deny that the war was assuming apocalyptic dimensions. A year and a half of ceaseless conflict had already claimed millions of lives. Multiples more were wounded, many irreparably. Countless thousands had literally disappeared on the battlefields of northern France, West Flanders, and Gallipoli, and in the seas. Most people sensed they were living through an unprecedented historical catastrophe with no end in sight. It needs saying, as horrible as the Second World War was, there's no parallel. The First World War was truly a horrible war, certainly worse for Canada, worse for Great Britain, worse for France. Only in the Second World War was it worse for Russia, Poland, and other countries, of Germany too, of course. Let's not forget Germany. Soldiers at the front living and fighting what was commonly described as a vast open grave remarked on the palpable evilness of their surroundings. And despite all of this, the majority of clerical speeches quoted in the press remained pretty moderate under the circumstances. So set against this general continuity, it is perhaps unsurprising that in later decades, much attention, though, has focused on those clerics who opted for a radical escalation of rhetoric. An unfortunate outcome of this emphasis on novelty, however, an outcome is the impression that it was representative of the churches much more broadly than was true. In fact, rather the opposite is true. Jingoism from the pulpit generated public discomfort, even more at the front, where soldiers held crusading religion in contempt. Discomfiting, unpopular, or as irresponsible as it may have been, the language of holy war that emerged in 1915 expressed a theological interpretation that justifies research into its origins, use, and effect. And Melinda, if we could go to the next slide.
Yes, I've done it.
Okay, great, thank you. Come to this gentleman in a moment. Anglican clerics in England who declared holy war were few, but they were influential for a combination of reasons. They were charismatic, they held high office, or they had high scholarly reputations. In other words, they were highly respected theologians. Their departure from the temperate majoritarian line of righteous war coincided with a series of outrages. Perhaps not, that's usually the way it goes. The Germans' successful use of gas at Ypres in April 1915, which by the time it was all over caused about 6,000 Canadian casualties in the span of 3 weeks. There was the sinking of the Lusitania a month later, plus various other atrocities, mostly committed against civilians and civilian infrastructure. And these were further aggravated by military failures at Gallipoli and a crushing disappointment in the wake of a much anticipated September breakthrough in northern France. So it was that in a June 1915 Guardian article, the evangelical firebrand, Arthur Winnington Ingram, Bishop of London, who's pictured in the slide, announced, quote, "The church can best help Britain by first of all making it realize that it is engaged in a holy war and not be afraid of saying so. You ask for my advice in a sentence as to what the church is to do. I answer, mobilize the nation for a holy war." After the failure of the Allied fall offensive, another cleric, Basil Bourchier, a Westminster vicar and friend of Winnington Ingram, declared, quote, "Not only is this a holy war, it is the holiest war that has ever been waged." Strong stuff. These and similar utterances were reprinted not just in the British press, but also in the Canadian press, where they made impressions on an understandably bewildered public. Yet, according to the only nationwide study of Canadian Anglican Great War sermons, a 2019 PhD dissertation, in fact, the crusading language of holy war held no appeal for the Anglican leadership of this country, as none resorted to it. Well, as it turns out, that conclusion was almost true. There was an exception to the rule, and that exception was here in New Brunswick. And so with that, we return to Bishop Richardson. Our only real insights into Richardson's theological mind regarding the war survive in contemporary newspapers and journals. Archival records beyond these sources, based on what I could find, contribute really nothing. But what is available in the press and synod journals supports my claim, provisional, of course, until proven otherwise, that Richardson was unique among Canada's Great War Anglicans with his Holy War Declaration of February 1916, which I opened this talk with. Let's give a little more context here. There were just over 70 Anglican priests in New Brunswick during the war years, inclusive of the half dozen or so who were released by Richardson for chaplain service overseas. Outside of this latter group, the chaplains, the vast majority of Anglican clerical voices during the war, unfortunately, remain inaccessible to us. Sermons are ephemeral. They're delivered, if they ever were written down. The vast majority of them never make their way into public archives. And so for the few that have survived, we are indebted to the secular and church presses. During the war, just 5 Anglican New Brunswick priests, the bishop among them, accounted for 90% of Anglican war-related quotes in the press. Of these, Richardson was a distant second to militant recruiter par excellence, as I call him, Reverend Bertram Hooper of St. Paul's Church in St. John. Hooper, by the way, was the first chaplain to the 26th New Brunswick Battalion that went overseas in 1915. Anyone unfamiliar with Church of England governance might find this counterintuitive given Richardson's office. Unlike today, however, the Anglican Church a century ago was less formally hierarchical. Centralized or coordinated, message control, if it existed at all, was informal or ad hoc. Aside from a limited number of representative or administrative responsibilities delegated to him by tradition and the diocesan synod, such as the granting of priests to leave serve as chaplains overseas, a bishop was still a priest and co-equal with his peers. Consequently, excuse me. Consequentially, the exigencies of war created the conditions whereby other priests, particularly charismatic ones ideologically aligned with the immediate interests of the state, were frequently quoted, often at length, in the local and provincial dailies or in a weekly national journal such as the Canadian Churchman, which was the national Anglican journal. So to the extent to which such a small sample of priests was representative of the whole is very difficult to say. What I'm getting at here is it's possible that there was another priest in the diocese somewhere who in his sermons might have invoked holy war. But furthermore, my point is that unless it turns up in an archives, we just don't know that. We don't have any access to that. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind. All we have to go on is the documentary evidence that we have access to. A couple of other contextual caveats bear mentioning. The mainstream press, remember I'm relying on the press significantly here, actively supported Canada's war effort. This meant that they privileged views in service of that aim, while simultaneously criticizing or ignoring dissent. Secondly, the war sermons of the province's Anglican priests generally accorded thematically with those elsewhere in Canada and the worldwide Anglican communion, namely those themes based in duty, sacrifice, honor, and righteousness. Variances on these themes were attributable to style and the messages that individual priests chose to emphasize, whether it was recruitment or home front service like charity, thrift, making comforts for soldiers. Conversely, and equally interesting, were those priests whom the historian would expect to find in the press and yet were conspicuous for their silence. Melinda, could you go to the next slide? Thank
John?
you. Yep, thank you. This fellow here is a standout example of this silent group. Hiram Cody, pictured here, was the rector of St. James Church of St. John. He was a very popular cleric, a best-selling author of adventure fiction, and possibly the province's best-known clergyman. Yet he was oddly silent in the press until the very eve of the national plebiscite on conscription, the so-called khaki election of December 1917, when he finally emerged and forcefully declared in favor of compulsory military service. Cody's belated arrival in the documentary record seems to be the only exception to a personal policy of his of forbearance on war-related matters. Why that was so is another interesting question, which I'm not going to explore here, but something very interesting for an historian of the Anglican diocese in New Brunswick. Anyway, juxtapositions like Cody and Hooper aside, the Anglican clergy were, in the main, as I've said, uncomfortable with the language of holy war, and they avoided it in their sermonizing. Whether this was based in their own theology or deference to their audience's sensibilities is hard to say. Instead, the tendency was towards moderation and the eschewing of bellicosity for subtle persuasion using the rhetoric of patriotism, sacrifice, honor, and duty in service of a just and righteous war. Despite the steady accumulation of casualties over 4.5 years, they held remarkably and consistently to these lines up to the armistice. So too did frontline and military hospital chaplains, who almost universally refrained from crusading and holy war motifs, having learned early in the war how despised these were by all but the greenest soldiers. So this brings me to my concluding thoughts. Long before the war, this is interesting, long before the war, Richardson himself cautioned that, quote, "In religious life, extremes are almost always a mistake." This nod to the wisdom of moderation in thought and speech, and his emergence later as a holy warrior in 1916 are striking contradictions. Now, the most charitable hypothesis for this attitudinal shift, I think it's fair to say, is the radicalizing potential of war, especially one that assumes an apocalyptic aspect, as this war did for so many. Interpretations of reality in time and place are limited to the analytical frameworks that we have at hand, individually and as societies. So to the extent to which these are culturally determined, they're limiting assumptions, and thus their utility can be quickly undone, I think, under radically changing conditions that involve acute uncertainty, insecurity, fear. In other words, the pre-war environment of civilizational progress and relative security and spiritual and material uplift, themes that I mentioned earlier, as perceived and promoted by cultural elites like Richardson, may have permitted, and this is where I'm speculating, but may have permitted latent radical conceptions of reality to lie dormant until a permission structure or a catalyst suited to their expression emerged. The war, I propose that the war created first the permission structure, and then provided an unending series of catalysts, each building upon the last. For some, the Bishop of London's Holy War speeches of 1915, offered an appealing supernatural explanation for the incomprehensibility of it all, based in legitimate, if controversial, theology. For reasons not yet clear, not clear to me anyway, Richardson had embraced this view by 1916 at the latest. By setting aside moderation and donning the mantle of holy warrior, he publicly and dramatically set himself apart from the consensus. If any other priests in the diocese, or for that matter in Canada, shared Richardson's holy war convictions, they have yet to surface in the documentary record, which I think conclusively, for now anyway, attests to the absolute rarity of the theological stance in Canada. For this reason, therefore, John Richardson remains a unique and an enigmatic figure in the cultural and church histories of Great War Canada. Final slide. Thank you, everybody. And I'll turn it back over to Ruth.
If he saw it as a holy war, why did he not organize public speeches to include other denominations? Was his message just for the Anglicans of New Brunswick?
I'll answer the second part to that question first. It was primarily directed to the Anglicans of New Brunswick, but more generally to all listeners. As to the first part of that question, I don't know. I haven't seen anything in the press or any other archival source or anything in the secondary literature.
Is this new liberal Christianity widely accepted in New Brunswick denominations as a whole? How close did we follow British denominations in this? Can you give an example?
I would first say that we follow the British denominations pretty closely. Anglicanism has always tended to be more conservative, along with Roman Catholicism among the Christian denominations. Now, within Anglicanism, there's no such thing as, I mean, like any denomination, there's diversity within each. Anglicanism is no exception. It has a conservative wing, high church, or Anglo-Catholics. Anglo-Catholics descend from the Tractarian tradition, which I mentioned earlier. Then you have the broad church, which is kind of like, like a political spectrum. You have the broad middle, right? Kind of the centrists. And then you have the other wing, which is more liberal and so forth, liberal and progressive. By the way, you can have evangelicals on the conservative side, and you can have them on the liberal side as well. Methodists were in Canada up until 1925, when the denomination ceased to exist, became part of the United Church, along with the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. Was probably the most progressive and liberal of the Canadian denominations. Presbyterians would have been, I think, closely behind them. And then within the Baptist Church, I think there's parallels to the Anglican Church as well. I'm not a church historian, so I'm going to stop there, because I might say something that I'm not an authority on.
Okay, so the next question was actually answered by somebody else in the chat, which led to another question. So I'll read the question answer and then the reply. Do we know what percentage of New Brunswick recruits were Anglican? And Curtis Mainfield replied, the short answer is no, we don't know the New Brunswick numbers. However, we have the St. John numbers. Anglicans accounted for 29% of volunteers, which is about 23% higher than their actual representation in the community. And then that was followed up with another question. Thanks, Curtis. Have these numbers been compared to other denominational representations?
Yeah, those are all great questions. Thank you, Curtis. Curtis is an old friend of mine. The Anglicans represented about 14% of the national population in 1911 and about 12% of the New Brunswick population in 1911. Nationally and in New Brunswick, Anglicans volunteered in numbers quite out of proportion. In other words, quite a bit higher than their share of the populations. There's some interesting historical reasons for that. And this goes to my master's thesis to a fair degree. In the first contingent, for example, depending on the source, but let's just say, 70 to 75% of those who enlisted in the first contingent that sailed overseas in 1914 attested as Anglicans. Now, there's a lot of speculation on why that may be. It's doubtful. It's doubtful that many were Anglicans. However, there was also a disproportionate, well over 50%, some figures put it as over 60% of the first contingent were actually British born. And the hypothesis is that many of them were looking for a way to get back home to England. There were large parts of Canada that were suffering from underemployment at the time. There was an economic recession. So if you believe there's going to be a short war, it'll be all over by Christmas. This is a great way to get back home to England. So we have to look at the Anglican numbers with a take it with a grain of salt. I don't want to take away anything from the volunteerism that was exhibited by other religious denominations.
Were Richardson's speeches mostly from the pulpit or synods or in public halls, etc.?
Well, he was everywhere. He was in the press. The press was, as I alluded to earlier, was very supportive of Canada's war effort. So any public leader of stature who was showing up at the Imperial Theatre, let's say, in St. John, or City Hall, or in a church pulpit, or on the street, or anywhere for that matter, could attract the attention of the press, and his words would be quoted often at length, verbatim, in the press the next day. So Richardson really was everywhere. Even when he was overseas, he went overseas in, I may get this wrong here now. He went overseas in late 1916 and returned in February or March of 17. He did a tour of the military hospitals in England and over in France, and he also visited the soldiers at the front. His words were telegraphed back to Canada and repeated the next day in the press, as were the words of chaplains, Bertram Hooper, who went over with the 26th Battalion in particular. His recruiting speeches never stopped right up until the day that the Military Service Act and conscription went into full force and effect. So these priests, not just of Anglican faith, but all of them, Baptists, Catholics, they were everywhere.
Did Richardson's views become more nuanced once he spent time at the front?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The short answer is no. There's always an asterisk beside that. Because this, again, I want to remind my audience here that I have since moved on. This was largely, what I'm talking about tonight is largely the domain of my master's thesis. I've moved into a more specialized aspect of religiosity and spiritualism for my dissertation. So short answer is no with an asterisk. I haven't seen anything that suggested moderation. Maybe I'll append to that answer this final thought. After the war, in 1919, I looked in the press up until about 1920, 21, in the Synod journals from 1919, 1920, and I think 21 as well. Richardson very quickly moved on. He didn't bring up the war, except in passing. But in that respect, he was really like every other Canadian. We wanted to put the terrible experience behind and get on with life. So I don't know. It's a really good question. I many times I wished his diary, if he kept a diary or journal, I wish it turned up. It'd be really neat to track down, if you could, his descendants and see if such a document has survived in the family. It doesn't exist in the provincial archives or in the diocesan archives, which are lodged at the provincial archives. I've been through the archives, the physical archives at the cathedral. There's nothing there either. So, a lot of things remain a mystery, but for the diligent historian who wants to take this project on, I suspect there's more answers to these questions out there.
Okay, so we have a comment in the chat. Prohibition and the plight of returning soldiers became prominent post-war issues for Richardson. And that is all the questions we have in the chat. So I'll open it up to the floor. If anybody would like to raise their hand and unmute, you're welcome. Oh, Jerry Lasky, you were quick to get your hand up there. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. A whole bunch of comments and a couple of questions. I think I'll just make a comment. I appreciate you say you're not a church historian. When I see the term liberal evangelical, unless I'm misinterpreting the earlier uses of it, especially when you talk about the Wesleys, I think socially liberal in terms of social causes and things like that, and the social gospel would apply to probably Richardson as well as the Wesleys, but it tends to mean liberal theologically.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's a little off-putting. You also mentioned religiosity and spiritualism. Well, religiosity is a great word, but spiritualism has a very specific meaning in terms of people who are into seances and things like that.
Yeah, did I say spiritualism? I thought I said spiritual. You're right about, sorry.
Spirituality.
Yeah,
spirituality, I think is the word. Just the Holy War aspect of this really, I'm trying to get my head around it. I think a lot of what you said about just the horror of the war and the slaughter on an industrial scale, that, you know, was very apocalyptic kind of thing. And we've seen that in Christian writers that came out of World War I experience, like Tolkien and Lewis, is one explanation probably. I'm wondering, is there any specific religious aspect to it? I'm thinking in terms of like the involvement of the Ottoman Empire and the religious animosity between Muslims and Christians. If that's an issue at all, I have no idea. And the other thing is Richardson's, was there anything in Richardson's personal life in terms of family involvement in the war, like children or anything like that, that might have had some influence on his views? So those are the two questions, I guess.
Yeah, good questions. No family members that went overseas. Unlike some of the other New Brunswick chaplains, yes, they did have. There was a fellow, William Baird, in Miramichi, for example. He didn't go overseas, but he had two sons who did. One of them was killed. Bertram Hooper, his son, who was a banker prior to the war, he quit the bank and went overseas. He survived. I can't think of any others at the moment. I mean, there were 70 Anglican priests in the province at the time. There must have been many others who had sons or daughters that brothers and other family members who went overseas. I don't have that information. You mentioned the Ottomans. That's a really good question. My final slide, I don't know if it's still up, maybe it's gone now, but you would have seen on the final slide there was a book cover. Philip Jenkins, The Great and Holy War. I'll use this opportunity just to take 30 seconds to tell you why I put that on that slide. That book really was kind of the genesis for my interest in my master's research, and because I've continued my investigations into Canadians' religious and spiritual life in the First World War, really it also deserves credit for the continuing research I'm doing. It's a really interesting book. I highly recommend it, but he very much gets into the religious aspects of the war from the perspective of the Ottomans, all Muslims, Hindus, Jews, religions around the world. So Philip Jenkins, The Great and Holy War. I'm not getting paid for this plug. It's a very good book. It's a page turner.
Okay, so I saw that, what was it, Nicholas Tracy?
I have a couple of comments that might be useful to you.
Mm-hmm.
25 years ago, the Barbican Gallery in London had a show of war art, and it included Canadian, British, French, German, Austrian. And if I remember correctly, which of course is a long time ago and a bit vague, but in 1914, they were all red hot advocates of the glories of war. But by 15, they had begun very radically to change their position on war. And again, I'm not being very accurate, but you might find it a useful way of timing changing attitudes. So have a look at the show reports. My other thing is that I remember reading Siegfried Sassoon's memoirs of an infantry officer, commenting on just how little anybody in England actually knew about what was going on at the front, and how they weren't really interested in finding out. It was there wasn't a backlash because the social implications, social expectations of the soldier trumped actual observation of what was happening. And this extended right to the British cabinet, that they just weren't prepared to. At one point, when they were talking about conscripting people in their 60s, and it was commented that, well, you know, once we have to start conscripting people that old, maybe we should be in this war after all. But anyway, so that lack of ability to know what was going on or to talk about it was certainly going to be affect the way that the public discourse went. And the third thing is just a little personal memoir. I crossed the Atlantic in what was it, 1968 in a freighter with a young German who had been captured in Normandy and had been a prisoner of war in England, then in Canada, and then in California. And he said that the farther away you got from the actual front, the more you became identified as the bad German. That in England, he was recognized as one who was caught up in something he didn't really make. But Canadians weren't prepared to see him that way. And Americans too, but his worst experiences were in British Columbia, where people just assumed that he was the villain. Really, that's all I have to say, but you might find that gives us sort of some useful perspectives.
That last one is certainly well attested, Nicholas. Thank you. Yeah, you know, it may seem counterintuitive to us, but it's well attested in soldiers' memoirs, but also in contemporary writings, that there was a great deal of empathy and sympathy on either side of the barbed wire at the front. The men, you know, the Canadian soldiers, the Allied soldiers, and the Central Power soldiers who were fighting each other, you know, really just meters apart, saw the humanity in each other and their shared plight, their shared suffering. And yeah, the further away you move from that front line, the more attitudes towards the enemy hardened.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and I suspect that that's may very well be the case today, even with social media and the rapidity with which information travels around the globe today. I suspect that's still the case. Nothing brings people together like shared suffering, even if they're opponents. As for Sassoon, hard to say. I would say this: what he said is contested. Far be it from me to outright disagree with Sassoon, someone of his standing, but it is contested. People at home knew what was going on. Soldiers, you know, maybe a little different in Canada because soldiers didn't come home to Canada on leave. It was too far, but they sure went home to Britain, and they were telling their families and friends of what it was like. And then there's the hundreds of thousands of wounded, many of whom were wounded or invalided out of the war, missing arms, legs, eyes, parts of their faces, you know, destroyed in mind. People knew what was going on. Same thing in France, even worse in France because it was, or Belgium, because it was fought on their soil.
Yeah.
In the States and Canada, probably less so, but I think, here too, people knew what was going on.
We have another comment in the chat. All of Richardson's children would have been too young to serve, and his brothers, half-brothers, would have been too old to serve. So that answers a question from
Saw that
earlier.
comment. Thank you.
Siobhan Lasky.
Siobhan posted that. Yeah. Thank you for that, Siobhan.
Thank you very much for joining us for this program. The next program will be in January. It's the third Thursday as our program night, and that will be January 19th. So January 19th, we'll be hearing from Zach Tingley. I don't have his topic yet, but keep an eye on the social media and the museum website, and they will post more information for us. So I hope to see you in the new year after the holidays. If you have any further questions for Ian, you can always contact the Fredericton Region Museum by email at frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com. That's all one word, no spaces, no dots, no underlines or anything, frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com, or you can give them a call at 506-455-6041. You can check out their website for information about their programs and their Facebook page. I always refer to the Facebook page. I spend way too much time there. And if you're looking for upcoming events. So with that being said, I'll see you in the new year.